We are resuming with the keynote lecture. And I just wanted to mention something that I didn't this morning, apparently. I thought I did, but maybe not. That we are planning to make a publication out of this symposium. So let's see in which way, in which form, but that's the idea. So I leave Professor Laskowska.
I welcome once again Professor Ciałowicz, our dear guest from Krakow. Professor Ciałowicz is professor at the Institute of Archaeology of the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. He studied at the same university where he also obtained his PhD and habilitation. Between 1996 and 2008, he served as vice director of the Institute of Archaeology of the Jagiellonian University for Student Affairs. In 2002, he received the title of professor, and in 2012, the position of full professor. Since 2008, he has been the director of the Jagiellonian University Institute of Archaeology. Professor Ciałowicz research focuses on the archaeology and art of ancient Egypt and the Middle East, with particular emphasis on the formative period of early civilizations. His main line of research addresses the origins of the Egyptian state and the beginning of monarchy, religion, and art in Egypt and the Levant. He is the author of many books, including The Beginnings of Egyptian Civilization and La naissance d'un royaume, l'Égypte de la période prédynastique à la fin de la première dynastie, and several dozen articles about predynastic and early dynastic Egypt. In his career, Professor Ciałowicz has participated in several excavations in Poland, Bulgaria, Norway, and of course, Egypt and Sudan. Since 1998, he is director of the Polish archaeological expedition to the Eastern Nile Delta, which concentrates its investigation on the site of Tel El Farha. The result of his work in Tel El Farha represent an integral part of his lecture today, which is in fact titled On the Border Between Egypt and the Levant, the Case of Tel El Farha. A realization of my dream to hear the information, to collect information on the North Egyptian border.
Thank you. Thank you very much. At the beginning, I would like to thank Dr. Maria Gatto for kind invitation for this conference, and Professor Laskowska-Kusztal for warm words. So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the researchers on the beginning of the relation between Egypt and the Levant have a long history. But initially, mostly Upper Egyptian sites and settlements and settlement in Mali were taken in consideration. Excavation in the Delta really started in the last 20 years of 20th century, and from this time our knowledge of history of 4th millennium BC was completely changed. Very important were researches made in the Eastern Delta by different expeditions. During the surveys, many pre- and early dynastic sites were discovered, and between them Tel El Farha and Tel El Mura, where is also active expedition from our institute directed by Dr. Jucha. During geological research, it was found that the coastline of the Mediterranean Sea was completely different than today. And the most important settlements were practically located by the sea. This is an important statement, especially considering the trade relations between Egypt and the Levant. At the turn of 5th and 4th millennium BC, in the Levant, interest in luxury goods is enlarging. Egyptians' interest in copper is also increasing. Contacts began during the Badari culture and at the beginning of Nagadawan. The trade routes may have run along the Red Sea. At that time, the delta was not yet accessible from environmental reasons. The situation changed in the period between Nagada 1C and 2C. Initially, the most important settlement was Madi, located at the basis of the delta. Analysis of the copper items discovered there confirmed that the raw materials came from the mine in Wadi Fainan, while the ingots corresponding in shape and size to those discovered in Tel Hurayat al-Ghuzian in southern Jordan. Later, Tel El Farha, a center particularly active from the Nagada 2B to C period, when Madi is abandoned, begins to play a decisive role. The site was discovered by Italian mission in 1987, but after 3 seasons of work, the project was abandoned. Since 1998, a Tel El Farha Polish expedition conducted by Dr. Marek Chłodnicki and myself is working. Our site is composed of 3 combs, western, central, and eastern, neighboring the village of Gazala, about 120 kilometers northeast of Cairo. They rise to the height of 5 meters over the level of surrounding fields and cover the area of over 4 hectares. At Tel El Farha, 7 main phases of occupation were distinguished. The oldest period is associated with the native inhabitants from the Lower Egyptian culture. During our phase 2, the first settlers from the south, probably associated with one of the first political centers in Upper Egypt. The apogee of Tel El Farha's development occurred since Nagada 2D2 and during Dynasty 0 and the first one. So in Tel El Farha phases 3, 4, and 5. In the middle of the first dynasty, the prosperity collapsed, but its inhabitants continued to live at the site into the early 4th dynasty. After that, the site was abandoned. The results of investigation into the Lower Egyptian occupation at Tel El Farha give us a completely new picture of delta. The big settlement on Central Com was evidently divided on 3 areas by fences made from organic materials. In eastern part, a row of few houses was discovered. In the northeastern part, only pits were located, so the economic function is clear. Even more important situation is on the western side of the mentioned fence, where next structure was located. We called it the Lower Egyptian residence. During the last campaign, we discovered a fragment of a next big edifice located on the south from the residence. In this layer, typical pottery was discovered. There are also present the fragments of pottery imported from the Near East and our oldest copper items. These copper items are similar to specimens discovered at the Ashkelon Barnea site in Israel. It is proof that in phase Nagada 2B to C, contacts between Egypt and the Levant were more developed, and Lower Egyptian communities importing copper from Wadi Fainan play an increasingly important role. From the same period, the proofs for close connections between Delta and Upper Egypt are evident. Nagadian pottery shells are quite common. Even more striking are grey-wake pellet in fish form as stone vessels, Upper Egyptian flint knives, and mace heads. Some of them were made from hard stones and were evidently used. Others, made from bone and undoubtedly painted with dark paint in a speckled pattern, should be treated as symbols. In the same layer, there were also found beads made of stone and gold. Analysis of imports distribution made by Dr. Chłodnicki show that most of the imported from Upper Egypt as well as from the Levant items were found inside the double fence enclosure. Only a few of them were discovered at the western com, but none in the row of houses on the east from the enclosure. Now it is clear that the mentioned above name, the Lower Egyptian residence, is justified. We received also the evidence that Lower Egyptian community was much more stratified than it was supposed earlier. It seems also that traces of social stratification in Lower Egyptian community should be found at the settlements and not at the cemeteries like in Nagada culture. In period contemporary with Nagada 2C, so about 3600, 3500 BC, but still during Lower Egyptian culture, wooden fences were replaced by mud brick walls built exactly in the same place. The important discoveries made in Lower Egyptian levels were the remains of a few breweries. All were similarly built. Each consists of several circular features surrounded by specific types of bricks. These bricks were inserted diagonally into the ground to support the vats. During Nagada 2B, breweries were surrounded by wooden fences separating them from the houses, which means that production area was controlled by Lower Egyptian elite living in the residence at Central Com. During Nagada 2C, just as on Central Com, wooden fences were replaced by mud brick walls. In the southern part of the brewery center, fragments of a room that could have served as a gate were discovered. Paleobotanical analysis clearly demonstrate that plant remains come from beer making. During one process, considerable amount of beer was received. It was used by the inhabitants of Tel El Farha, but at least a part of it was possible sent outside. The analysis of animal and fish bones allowed to suppose that quite numerous account of meat was also exported, not only chicken, as well as Nilotic mollusks, very popular at the southern Levantinian sites. Instead of these, materials and different goods were imported to Tel El Farha. Domestic donkey bones are another proof for trade activity of the local community. Relatively high number of donkey bones and the lack of break marks on them, as well as the age of animals, they are mostly adults, suggests that donkey were used first of all as packed animals. All this data strongly suggest that trade with Levant and Upper Egypt was one of the most important branch of economy Lower Egyptian inhabitants of Tel El Farha. It is important to stress that these people established very intensive and highly developed trade relations with southern Levant from one side and Upper Egypt from another. Results for Egyptian societies were similar. The Nagadian, as well as inhabitants of Delta, became more and more stratified. It is proved by the graves from Upper Egypt and Lower Egyptian residents from Tel El Farha. In some moment, during very high flow of the Nile, the settlement at our site was destroyed. Evidence of catastrophic flooding of the Nile, destroying at least the eastern delta, has also been discovered at other sites, like Tel El Mura, where relics dated to Lower Egyptian culture are buried under a thick layer of silt. It can therefore be assumed that the beginnings of so-called Nagadian expansion into the delta were influenced to some extent by the destruction of at least some of the settlements by natural forces. The appearance of large numbers of southerners in these settlements should come as no surprise. The importation of various raw materials and products from the southern Levant was necessary for the political centers developing in Upper Egypt to ensure adequate prestige. It should be emphasized, however, that not all settlements destroyed by the Nile flood were quickly repopulated. For example, the settlers returned to Tel El Mura only after 300 years. So sites like Tel El Farha must have been attractive and more important than other settlements in the area. Thus, it seems that the flooding of the Nile may contributed to the permanent settlement of newcomers from the south. But it is important that the inhabitants of Lower Egyptian residence survived because this building was still used. In effect, the Nagadans built the first huge edifice in the destroyed area in the location earlier occupied by breweries. It means in a place outside the Lower Egyptian town center where probably local elites continue to reside. Of course, relations were built earlier, but one can imagine that at the beginning of trade relations, it was not necessary for southerners to stay in the delta for a long period. In Nagada 2D1, so about 3,500, 3,400, this situation was changed, maybe because Upper Egyptian nobles or chiefs demanded much more imported products and amount of goods exchanged was increased. This first huge Nagada building at Tel El Farha, raised at the beginning of phase 2, it was rebuilt several times. The oldest building had a simple layout. On the top of the western comb, a huge complex was built, surrounded by thick, almost 1 meter, 50 centimeters from all sides. Only the eastern one was unearthed in full. Inside the building, the remains of poorly preserved small rooms were recognized. They were rectangular and square, probably circled around an inner open courtyard. In some of them, a lot of pottery shards and almost complete vessels imported from southern Levant were discovered. The walls of rooms were only 30–40 centimeters wide. It is then possible that the main function of thick outside walls was separation from the rest of the settlement, and perhaps they should be even treated as defensive walls. The size of the last structure may be described as monumental. The concentration of storage vessels at the western, eastern, and southern ends of comb suggest that main rooms of the Nagada building were surrounded by magazines. The same group of southerners erected another great edifice, on top view from the west, on bottom from east. It was constructed on the western edge of central comb on the western part of Lower Egyptian residence and was composed from at least 3 rooms en suite, each 8.5 meters long and 2.7 meters wide. The westernmost and southern parts of that complex were destroyed in ancient times. This building was most probably played a role of central storage, and its size indicates significant amounts of stored goods. We can distinguish 2 phases of the building, older, now on the screen, from the beginning of Nagada 3A1, so about 3,400. Younger stage of this building is dated to Nagada 3A, middle of 3B, our phase 4. During the younger phase, in the southeastern corner of northern room, an oven with a vessel inside was located. Near the oven, more than 80 unfired clay balls were found. Probably they were prepared as tokens, but from unknown reasons never finished and used. But it is the proof that such items were connected with trade and produced on the place. If our reconstruction based on models of storage known from the first intermediate period is right, we receive the confirmation that a lot of types of buildings, art motifs, as well as customs have their roots in the pre-dynastic period. The older phase of warehouse was evidently connected with the Nagada building on the western comb. That may be the proof for the great role played by trade in the life of the inhabitants of this edifice. Probably it was a residence house with storerooms that belonged to the South Egyptians, who controlled the trade exchange between Levant and the Nile Delta on one end and Upper Egypt on the other. Possibly they have been connected to one of the early Egyptian rulers. At about the same time as warehouse from Tel El Farha, a set of silos storing grain was built in Ptora, located on the north edge of Negev near Tel Erani. Its size far exceeded local needs, which may also suggest stockpiling for trade purposes. In the Nagadian building were represented plain seals and those with cylinder impression, as well as tokens. Here, but also in other places of the settlements, fragments of pottery of southern Levantinian origin were discovered. In between, potsherds typical for early bronze 1B Erani Sea horizon, attested at Tel El Farha from the end of Nagada 2D2 until the end of Nagada CA. All these finds confirm that the most important for the inhabitants of described building was the trade. This edifice from Western Com was burned at the end of Tel El Farha phase 3, so during final stage of Nagada 3A1, about 3,300. The fire could be the result of an intentional action. This supposition is confirmed by the situation recorded in other parts of the site. At Central Com, a burned layer ended older phase of warehouse, but very quickly the edifice was rebuilt on the same place and still used. At the Eastern Com, first settlement founded by settlers from the south was also destroyed by fire. In small cross-section, the remains of two walls forming rectangular rooms were discovered. Between them, a heap of destroyed mud brick is visible. This edifice was covered with thick, up to 80 centimeter burnt layer. We can thus suppose that during early Nagada 3A, the entire settlement at Tel El Farha was destroyed as a result of human action. At the same time, the emergence of early proto-kingdoms in Upper Egypt can be assumed, for example, at Abydos and Hierakonpolis. It is very likely that both centers were competing in various fields. The dominant issue could be the control over trade routes leading to the Levant. We can also presume that the first Nagadian settlers in Tel El Farha, the builders of the Nagada residence, originated from a different center than their successors. The second group of southerners should be regarded as the builders of the oldest stage of administrative cultic center at Western Com. This complex was erected on the ruin of the burned residence. From the beginning, very complicated plan was applied with many rooms of different destination around central courtyard. The same people erected at the Eastern Com the oldest Egyptian mastaba, dated to the end of Nagada 3A, so more or less 3,300, 3,250. It covers an area of over 300 square meters and is composed of several chambers separating with massive walls up to 2.5 meters thick. The edifice was erected on the layer of destruction. More or less from the same time is the famous grave UJ from Abydos. Comparison of the dimension of grave UJ and our mastaba is significant. We can assume that it was made for a person from society's highest. On south from the mastaba, a wall separating rest of settlement was built. On north and east, next wide walls were established. They separated poor settlement. Buildings were badly made, but items discovered in them are remarkable. Also, distribution of some of them is significant. In one room, a lot of bread molds, in another, copper butcher knife, in third one, flint workshop producing sickle blades. From the same layers came anthropo and zoomorphic figurines, copper and bone harpoons, slate pellets, stone vessels, flint knives, and a lot of small pots. All the mentioned objects could be used during posthumous cult. If so, maybe we should interpret all the area on north from the mastaba as a kind of estate or foundation connected with the owner of mastaba and used for his posthumous cult. If this hypothesis is right, the tradition known from dynastic times is much older than it was supposed, as well as idea of mastaba itself. To the southeast of this monumental edifice, a few smaller mastaba graves were uncovered. All of them date to the first part of Nagada 3B, so between 3250 3200. In the ordinary settlement from the same period, tokens and play seals are still in abundance. The most interesting is clay cylinder seal with Horus and Nepti names. The second name is oldest example of using this part of your royal titular, much older than was until now supposed. It is also the proof of strong connection between Tel el-Farha and early Egyptian rulers. In this period, besides southern Levantinian pots, also fragments from northern Canaan appeared. Especially important is the fragment in the middle of screen. Until now, only analogy was found in Megiddo. Its presence in Tel el-Farha testifies to local people's extensive contacts that reached far beyond the area of southern Canaan. Between the imports from this period, we should mention copper as raw material and probably some of the finished copper artifacts. Imported are also obsidian and bitumen, on right on the slide. At first glance, Tel el-Farha continued to flourish during the next phase. Even then, however, at least several phenomena are evident that portend gradual decline of the city, eventually leading to its abandonment. Phase 5 at Tel el-Farha is dated contemporary with the reign of Dynasty 0 and the early First Dynasty, from Irihor to Ger, more or less. In that phase, a vast settlement and central com was existed, as well as numerous small mastabas in the cemetery at Eastern Com. Most important is the administrative cultic center at Western Com. It was rebuilt a few times, reaching its ultimate form toward the end of that period. Two votive deposits were discovered there. Therefore, it may come as a surprise to see the abandonment of the administrative cultic center at Hul, Western Com, with the end of phase 5. The abandonment of mentioned large warehouse at the central Com towards the end of phase 4 and replacement them with regular houses can be read as a foreshadowing of these events. No evidence of major storage facilities have so far been discovered at Tel el-Farha from phase 5. Such structures are known again from phase 6. Perhaps in the second half of Nagada 3B, the Egyptians gradually abandoned the trade routes running through the eastern delta, and instead goods and raw materials were imported directly to the major cities of Upper Egypt or newly established power center at Memphis. In this situation, only a few imported products would have reached settlement like Tel el-Farha, which may explain the lack of both central warehouses and imported ceramics. The shift in trade routes is evidenced by research at Kafr Hassan Dawood in Wadi Tumilat. These important trade routes bypassing the eastern delta was very popular in the Pharaonic area, but used also in the pre-dynastic. The most burials on the cemetery were contemporary with phases 5 and 6 at Tel el-Farha, so second part of Nagada 3B and 3C, clearly points to the relatively late establishment of the settlement and its rapid development during the reigns of Dynasty 0 and 1. It also seems that from Dynasty 0 onwards, Egyptians were more directly involved in exploration of natural sources, primarily those in the Sinai. This is corroborated by the analysis of copper objects from this period discovered at Tel el-Farha. It clearly shows that the raw material came from Sinai. Rock inscriptions from Wadi Aymeira confirm that at least during Dynasty 0 and the first southern Sinai was explored by expeditions sailed by early Egyptian kings. One of those engravings representing a boat with a small cabin and the name of Erechor. Above them, city wall and pear-shaped maze was placed. The relief confirms Erechor's interest in exploring the Sinai and suggests his links with Memphis. This may prove the existence of trade route bypassing the East Delta and leading from the Sinai directly to Memphis. The exploration of the Sinai was apparently not the only focus of Erechor's interest. He most likely also subjugated the Eastern Delta. It is evidenced by the situation recorded at Tel el-Farha. In the northern part of Eastern Cone, remains of two golden figurines, together with two large flint knives, as well as necklace of ostrich eggshells and carnelian beads were excavated. We may date the time the objects were deposited to the middle of Nagada 3B. Nevertheless, analysis of both figurines and items deposited together allow to suppose that figurines were created during Nagada 3A or even at the end of Nagada 2D. It means that they were probably connected with the second group of migrants from the south. It is also possible to recognize them as representing anonymous predynastic ruler during his Hebset. If this hypothesis is right, we received another proof that Tel el-Farha was one of the most important centers in the formative stage of Egyptian kingdom. It is also worth to stress that all items forming the golden deposit were produced from imported material: lapis lazuli and gold for figurines, ostrich eggshells and carnelian for beads or flint knives. In the same time, on the wall separating the mastaba from the south, two graves were located: small mastaba number 63 and two chamber graves 69. Both graves are very precisely dated to the reign of Erechor, because wine jar from grave 69 bears his name. The fact that golden figurines were not recovered in the past seems to indicate that the people who had hidden the figurines never returned to Tel el-Farha and were replaced by completely new inhabitants. This means that the discussed situation could also be connected with some changes in occupation and that settlers from another part of Egypt appeared. We would have the third group of southerners, very probably linked with Abydos and its ruler, Erechor. Few names of Erechor engraved on vessels from our side point to the reign of this ruler and determine the beginning of phase 5 at Tel el-Farha. Erechor's policy probably also affected the fate of settlements in southern Levant. One of the most important is Tel el-Rani, where we excavated from almost 10 years in the northern part of Negev. There a lot of Egyptian imports as well as tokens and seal fragments were discovered. Pottery points to the period between second part of Nagada 3B and 3C1. Important was discovery of bread molds made from local clay, but in Egyptian way. This is evidence of the presence in Tel el-Rani of a group of Egyptians probably supervising trade. In this period, In the period earlier than Narmer's reign, marked at Telerani by distinctive vessels and this Serek, the building was destroyed by fire, but whether it was a result of accident or intentional action is still difficult to say. Interesting is that from that time at Tel el Farha were discovered only imitation of Levantinian pottery and a lot of tokens and seal impression as well as half of cylinder seal. It seems that trade with Levant was still very important for the inhabitants of Tel el Farha, but probably they used their own pottery for transporting goods. Egyptian vessels, especially so-called wine jars, were much more stronger and better for transport than pots made in the Levant. The information from Palermo stone about very high flooding during the reign of Den may indicate circumstances under which Tel el Farha begins to lose its importance. The abandonment of Western Com clearly followed a major catastrophe caused by natural forces. Evidence of such catastrophe at the turn of our phase 5 and 6 are also found at the Eastern Com. The great, possibly cultic building erected at the eastern border of the cemetery at the beginning of our phase 5 was also destroyed at the turn of phases 5 and 6. The fallen walls and the layer of silt on the surface of the ruined building suggest a natural catastrophe. Around the same time, small mastabas dating the entire Nagada 3B period were flooded by a layer of silt. On the slide, grave 63, which I showed you earlier, covered by a layer of silt. As a result, both of the destroyed building and silt-flooded graves were probably now visible on the surface, and graves dating to the turn of Dynasty 1 and 2 were cut into the ruins of building and proto-dynastic graves. For instance, grave number 126 was dug into the superstructure of proto-dynastic mastaba number 130. The subordination of the Eastern Delta to the Abydos-based rulers of Dynasty 0 may have resulted in a significant reduction of the role of previous most important centers. The weakening of Tel el Farha's position was undoubtedly influenced by changes in trade routes as well as natural reasons. It is therefore possible that in the middle of the first dynasty, the local elite moved from Tel el Farha to another center. The remaining part of society, until the final abandonment of settlement, took part only in local trade and maintained themselves by agriculture, animal husbandry, or fishing. The crops were collected in a big tower silo at Central Com. It was built in Tel el Farha phase 6, so in the second part of the first dynasty, and supervised by a high-ranking official, as evidenced by a big stamp seal with a hieroglyphic sign discovered in a house in the direct vicinity of the silo. In conclusion, it is worth emphasizing that the location of Tel el Farha on the Egyptian-Levantinian border resulted in its enormous and rapid development. Some researchers with some exaggeration, like Pierre de Mirochegi, even considered our settlement as metropolis establishing colonies in southern Levant. But the same location of Tel el Farha evidently contributed to its fall when trade routes changed due to the exploration of new territories in Sinai. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks. We have a lot of time for discussion because it's only one opportunity to discuss now because professor has a train afternoon to Krakow. Huh?
Any question?
Thank you for this very interesting lecture. I have a question. Did you study where is the wood from? The wood used for posts for defense?
We have some information that it's local wood.
You don't know what kind of?
No, not imported.
Not imported.
Not imported.
And carnelian and obsidian?
With obsidian is still problem. As you know, it's impossible to make analysis in Egypt. So it's still the same situation. So two possibilities, or Ethiopia or Anatolia. So we are not sure, but judging from the discovery also the bitumen, we have some limbs of bitumen found. So I suppose that rather eastern direction is more probable.
So apart from bitumen and obsidian, there is no other indication toward Ethiopia?
No.
Okay, and no clue about carnelian, right?
Carnelian is probably from the desert, from the eastern or desert, so it's abundance. Also, since flint, also we suppose that most of the flint was imported from eastern desert or from Upper Egypt.
Because at the same time, in the later phase of Tel Farha, there are clear evidence of trade, not border with Byblos, right? And
with Byblos, no, which Megiddo for the north until now.
Too far to the north?
To the north, Megiddo, we have the confirmation that we have some fragments of pots from Megiddo. So.
In Tel Farha. Yeah, but on the other hand, you have evidence like mace heads and pottery in Byblos, in EB, starting in EB1.
But you know, so mace heads is a lot of in Upper Egypt. So it was rather imported from Upper Egypt.
Not necessarily from Tel Farha itself.
Yeah, but the bone models probably were made on place, painted as walls. But we have mace heads, not only this pear-shaped, but also this from the earlier period. So evidently from the south, from Upper Egypt.
I hoped for a wood transported from the north. Thank you.
Yeah, no. Must be some relations. Copper is evident at first, at the beginning from the Fainan, later from Sinai, but also some other oil, wine. So it should be imported from the north, from the southern Levant. So a lot of meat which was evidently sent outside our site, it's proof for the trade relation, and I don't suppose that they sent the meat to the south to the Upper Egypt, rather to the Sinai or Levant.
About the wood, cedar has been used in the tomb at Umm el-Kab, so the first dynasty tomb. So, but this is also, it's a reaction and a question at the same time, because you mentioned these changes in the ways exchange routes were organized. And so for most of that period, it was terrestrial route from the Sinai, etc., up to the Levant, but at some point during the EB1, but it is, as you know, difficult to really pinpoint what EB1 relates to in Egypt at the same time. You know, it's Dynasty 0, Dynasty 1, etc. And Dynasty 0 and Dynasty 1, and as we saw this morning, it's very different in terms of context and things happening in the Nile Valley. But during the EB1, there's a change, and perhaps you can confirm or not, with the material from Tel el-Farka, but the sea route became more and more important, and you have anchorage points along the coast in the Levant, and most probably the what was made by caravans or things like that, what will become later the way of Horus, you know, this route toward the Sinai and the Levant, it shifted to an exchange routes by boats along the coast. Yes, and then from Byblos probably, yes, up to the delta, and then that's from where most probably the cedar woods, etc., arrived, and then was transported in Upper Egypt. And that's the problem. How can we connect? That's the problem. What can we connect Farka and what happened back then with this change from the terrestrial route? From the were they working together, or boats took everything at some point? It's difficult to say. And what's the connection then with the Delta and Upper Egypt? Why don't we have anything like that in Farka, but we have them in Abydos, for example, the wine and the cedar woods, etc., the first dynasty? But there's a connection there. There's still connection that perhaps we can make between the Delta and Upper Egypt during this transition, Dynasty 0 and Dynasty 1.
I would like to add that very important are this Irani Sea pottery. Because if I know such pottery was found in grave UJ in Abydos and in one grave in Gersey. I don't know any settlement except Tel Farha with such kind of pottery. It's a very specific and characteristic kind of pottery. So it's also proof that some pots with something inside was imported to Farha, maybe sent later on south. So from this period, I think that the main trade routes was through the Delta, and later from the Dynasty 0 bypassing Delta.
Any more questions?
The relations between Egypt, between Farha and the Levant are clear. But do you have some anthropological evidences that people from the Levant state lived in Farha?
Until now, not. It's difficult to say. As you know, this problem with samples, and from the Levant in Israel is a problem with human bones. So it's difficult to compare. So we have any such information. Only imports any more information.
I would like to ask, I have a question about Tel Ibrahim Awad. It was colony with Levantine people?
I don't believe, because in Tel Ibrahim Awad, in fact, it's a very poor preserved site. Van den Brink and later Van Harlem have only, in fact, a small trench, because the rest was destroyed by the modern fields. So they have luck that they found these deposits and the rest of the temple. But it's for me, it's Egyptian as well as Tel El Iswit or other sites, Mishara Womar and so on. So really Egyptian. Only maybe some Levantine people were in early Buto and in Madi. So two exceptions. Later, I think that it was in hands of Egyptians.
Do we have any question from Teams? So anybody from online has any question? Anybody from here? No, if not, I have a question. And from a more general point of view, so how do you see this northeastern border of during really the moment of state formation, so before and after the unification? How do you see how it was working at that time?
Sorry, I think that there was a few centers similar to Farha. At first was Minshad Abu Omar, but it was a little bit later, and Tel El Iswit also. But the rest probably was in some relations with these main centers. and the people living there maintained the trade relations with the Levant and later with southern Egypt also. So not border as line, but rather a lot of centers which acted in the exchange.
So we have seen to the south that we have, rock art used to mark the landscape. You don't have rock art, of course.
In Delta, it's difficult to make such signs like in Upper Egypt. The nearest, as Dorian said, are on Sinai. So, but for this early period, Sinai was explored, but from time to time, not permanent. Later, I think from Jericho. So for me, the really founder of Egyptian state is Jericho, not Narmer. So-called unification was much earlier, and of course started from the cultural unification and then political step by step. So Farha shows that was at least few groups from internal migration, as we can say, coming from south and taking the land, taking the trade routes and so on. So competing centers on south evidently was interested to have at least a supervisor on the trade routes.
Yeah, that's why. But do you have any idea who these different Nagadans coming to the north could have been? These three phases of people.
If you look on the history of the whole Nagada culture, please look that the first step was taking the area of former Badari culture. Later, the Nagadians stopped for a moment, but during the Nagada 2C to D, they reached almost Fayum region. So this slowly we're going to north. And end of Nagada 2, I think that with help of natural reasons, they entered to the delta, and the so-called invasion. It was not a real invasion, but rather possible to take destroyed settlements, new lands, and so on. And in the same time, the cemeteries at the south are abandoned. A lot of cemeteries in the Upper Egypt is emptied suddenly. So probably the people was going to north, but the problem is they would like to do because they want, or they were pressed by somebody who was on the top of the state and sent them to north for cultivate the land, for instance.
It's interesting because it's a completely different situation compared to the south, where these people had let's say this community has a different background, so there is always a shared tradition between Egyptians and Nubians, let's say, so along the Nile, and with the state formation, they had to find a way to be different, so they distinguish one to each other. So you have the Egyptian, let's say, culture that comes out, not the Nagada culture. To the north is completely different because they have to impose their culture, and it's a sort of moving frontier, no? So it's going north and north and north, and within Egypt. So it's a different complete situation, which is also because there is not a Nagada background in the Delta before. So you have first to establish yourself there, move your frontier north, and then think of, let's say, enlarging farther north, so outside what was dynastic Egypt.
Yeah, it was, I think, completely different situation. You remember this old theory of Stefan Weidelmeier, then the area around the Elephantine was depopulated, in fact, during the reign of the first kings. It is a really fact, or it is only the imagination?
Yeah. Yeah, that's also the other point. Do you have evidence of possible nomadic communities around the Telfar or in the Eastern Delta? Because in the West we have the fibrous weir that maybe is telling us.
We suppose to tell the truth. One of my colleagues, which was working about the relations between Levant and Egypt, presume that in the first step, a very important role was made by nomads from Sinai. So, in fact, they were the people which taken the products in Levant and bring them to Egypt. Not the Levantinian, not the Egyptian, but these people which living in the middle. Later, of course, the state was grow up and the power of kings was much stronger. So probably they take it under control. But earlier, I think to at least to beginning of Nagada 3, nomads have a quite big role, but unfortunately we haven't any evidence for that.
And that's also very interesting because in the South it's the same with the A group. Mm-hmm. But the A group, so the Nubian, develop a very complex polity contemporary to Nagada Dynasty 0, Nagada 3. So there is this kind of parallel development also from a political perspective, complexity that apparently there is not with the nomads of the North. No. We don't, or at least we cannot see it archaeologically.
They must be there.
Now, just to complete what the professor was saying about the nomads in the Sinai, probably, I don't remember the dates, but probably it's for the earlier periods, contemporary to Mahdi. There are in the Sinai these Nawamis tombs that is difficult to date because there's no specific pottery inside. But there are sometimes fan scrapers that normally we find in Mahdi coming from Jordan. And
you have also.
And there are, for example, the shells from the Nile. So even if we cannot date this Nawamis tomb, but probably they are from the pre-dynastic periods, and probably it's the owner of these tombs that in some way connected Levant and Mahdi in the case of the things that I studied, but also possibly later.
So there is some complexity. It's just that it's different kind of complexity and we don't see it and it's not well studied. Well, any other question from here? Yes.
So one more question regarding this pre-state situation, political situation, like when Farha was an important center. How did it function? There were several centers at the same time. Were they like a city-state? Sorry for my Mesopotamian perspective here, but I'm trying to imagine it like having villages and then nomads around, like more complex organization.
I believe that if situation in Egypt will be a little bit different, so Upper Egypt was much more involved to Nubia and south direction. So I believe that in Delta we will have as a result town cities. Because now we have only in fact, only Farha, partially Tel al-Iswid, and partially Butov from different reasons. But it seems that it was a few strong centers. Later, during the first dynasties, it was changed. But at the beginning, a few centers at least was at Farha. So this hypothesis of Miroshegi, which believes that Tel Sakan was established by people from Farha, of course, it's not true, but it shows that some ideas about the relation between Levant and Egypt are still not solved and still is questionable in different ways.
Let's check again if there is any question from online. If not, I don't think so. Okay, if not, we stop here. We thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Many thanks.